Welcome to the first official episode of the Bears Talk podcast. I'm Brian Perez, the managing editor of BearsTalk.com, and it's appropriate to have our first episode after a bunch of firsts just took place over the weekend for the Bears. Their first preseason win, the first start for Justin Fields under Luke Getsy's watch, the first for a lot of the Bears rookies to finally don those Bears colors and make their debut. We got a lot to talk about today on the Bears Talk podcast, so we'll be right back. The Bears are officially undefeated. It's been a long time since we could say that. And yes, it was a meaningless first preseason game, but it still matters. New head coach, new offensive coordinator, new general manager. We could argue a new franchise quarterback. Getting that first win against the Kansas City Chiefs in the preseason, it was good. It's a victory Monday for Bears fans. And you know what? If we start off the 2022 season with that kind of optimism, who knows how far this team can go in 2022. What was really fun to watch during Saturday's game against the Kansas City Chiefs, though, was not only did we get to see Justin Fields and his maturation already early in his second season, he looked like a different quarterback. You could tell he's being coached up by Luke Getsy. He gets the system, his progressions, his calm composure in the pocket. There were a lot of positives from Justin Fields, and we're going to talk about this in great detail in a few minutes with our special guest, Luke Easterling, the managing editor of the Draft Wire, one of the best draft analysts and experts out there. He did a lot of work on Justin Fields when he was coming out as a draft prospect. So we're going to dive deep into his thoughts on Fields, not only as a draft prospect in his rookie year, but also what he thought of him on Saturday night and what his expectations are from the Bears franchise quarterback this year. And we're going to dive into the rest of the Bears rookie class who was able to get on the field on Saturday. You all have seen the clips of Jaquan Brisker, the highlight plays that he made. That's the obvious stuff, right? But I want to dive deeper into the trenches. Left tackle Braxton Jones, he started the game, and I thought he played pretty well. We'll jump into that with Luke as well. And just what do we think so far of this first offseason, now that we're into the season, of Ryan Poles? I mean, something that we heard so much about during free agency, during the NFL draft, was the things Ryan Poles should have been doing. He should have signed wide receivers. He should have drafted wide receivers. He didn't support Justin Fields with any kind of blue chip offensive lineman via a trade up in the NFL draft or a big franchise type signing, free agent signing that could give Fields the protection that a lot of analysts are saying he's without right now. We'll dive deep into that as well. Why wait any longer? I say we bring the man, the myth, the legend, my good buddy, one of my longest running friends in the industry. Let's get him on the show now. Luke, welcome to the Bears Talk podcast.
Good to be here, man. Good to be here. Good to see you. And it's we're usually looking at each other's faces across the table at Saucy Q's, or we usually go to Dreamland. That's usually closer to the hotel in Mobile. But here we are talking actual football, real football that's happening.
Listen, those trips to the Senior Bowl are some of my favorite memories in this business. We've had a lot of laughs and we've made a lot of good memories down there. And a lot of the draft hopefuls that we see come through the cycle every year really kind of kick off their draft experience in Mobile at the Senior Bowl. And then it goes to the Combine. And then obviously they go on from there. And there's sometimes guys like a Braxton Jones, a small school guy who uses the All-Star circuit, uses the NFL Combine to put his name on the radar. And might as well just start right there, Luke. Braxton Jones is a player who the Bears drafted out of Southern Utah in the 5th round of this year's draft. He was the highest investment in terms of draft capital that the Bears made on an offensive lineman. When he was picked, the general thought process was this is a developmental offensive lineman. At least that's what my scouting report said too. A developmental prospect, 2 or 3 years into his career, he'll have a chance to possibly fight for a starting job. But here he is, day one, the left tackle of the Chicago Bears, blocking Justin Fields' blindside. The future, the past, present, and future of this organization depends on Justin Fields. Give us your thought of Braxton Jones, the prospect, and now his outlook moving forward as a starting left tackle?
Yeah, Braxton Jones is one of the many picks in this draft where every year I like to match up, obviously where guys came off the board, where I had them overall on my board. Obviously, those are two very different things because every team has its own set of variables that we in the media don't work with. We kind of work in a vacuum. But in terms of overall value, I mean, Braxton Jones was a 4th-round grade for me. I had him in the 140 range. I had Dominic Robinson there too. So both of their 5th-round picks were 4th-round guys for me. My cat is saying hello, by the way. If you can hear that in the background, it's something's going on. But Braxton Jones, when you look at this guy and you look at all the physical traits, right? If you put him in a Power 5 program, just no name, just put those traits, the size, the length, put all those things in an Ohio State uniform, put him in an Alabama or a Georgia uniform. Do you think that guy goes in the 5th round? I don't think so. You go back and look at a guy. Maybe it's not a great comparison in terms of how his career turned out, but guys like LaRaven Clark, I remember prospects that had really long arms, athletic guys that you think like, oh, high ceiling guys, they can develop. And then when they go in the 2nd round and they don't pan out, you're like, oh man, maybe we shouldn't worry so much about the traits. But the only thing that I think made Braxton Jones go in the 5th round was the fact that he played at Southern Utah. So, when you look at the actual player, I'm with you. I think everybody thought maybe this is a guy a year or 2, 3 down the road, he could develop into that guy. He went to a place that doesn't really have the luxury of waiting around that long. So why not throw him into the fire, see what he's got? And like you said, from what I saw on Saturday, seemed to hold his own. And again, backed up really the good bit I saw on tape of just his ceiling. Again, consistency, technique. That's what coaches are for. That's what NFL coaches are paid to do, to develop that stuff. He's got some of those traits that you just can't teach in terms of the size and the length, the athleticism, the mean streak, the power, the wanting to play with a physical mentality and kind of punish those pass rushers. You can't really teach all of that stuff. And I think the fact that, again, I know we're going to talk about the coaching and the general manager and the new regime there, but I think the biggest win for the Bears this year was all of those changes on the staff side of things, so that when you take a guy like Braxton Jones at a premium position in the 5th round, maybe you can get a franchise left tackle out of that. And that's obviously a huge steal.
It's interesting. One of the things you mentioned there that I think it's really important for Bears fans to kind of remember as we go through this process is Braxton Jones is a perfect example of how NFL players and their career trajectory, the success they enjoy as a pro, sometimes is as simple as a byproduct of where you end up. Braxton Jones is on a team with an unsettled offensive line. No clear left tackle starter. Larry Borum was supposed to be that guy. He was a 5th rounder last year. Tevin Jenkins, obviously the saga with him, it's kind of unraveled here in his 2nd year. He's trying to work his way back potentially into the starting lineup down the road, but there was no established veteran left tackle who you could really say, this is the Bears starter at left tackle. And here's Braxton Jones, this rookie surprise who's outplayed him in training camp. And the coaches bumped up to the starting lineup and bumped a veteran down to the 2nd team. It's kind of like he's just getting thrown into the fire because there's really no one else that the Bears could really start that do have his traits, that have his upside. But Bears fans have to be a little bit careful before assuming that Braxton Jones is this mega hit on day 3 because of his position as a starter right now. It's really just he might be the best of a really average to below average group of people competing for that left tackle job. But again, we've seen this in Chicago before. Several years ago when Charles Leno was drafted in the 7th round, he was kind of an afterthought as an offensive tackle to compete for a starting job. He ended up becoming one of the most consistent and reliable left tackles the Bears have had in many, many, many years. So it's not uncommon for teams to find these kinds of hits, especially with the offensive linemen. Offensive linemen that end up outplaying or overplaying their draft stock it's not a story we rarely hear. That's a pretty common theme. So Braxton Jones might be able to continue that, hopefully, for the Bears. And if he does, Luke, this has a chance to be a pretty good draft class for Ryan Poles' first swing here. We saw Jaquan Brisker on Saturday night make a couple of highlight Mike Brown-esque plays for the Bears with big hits and plays on the ball and just being in the right spot with his instincts and athleticism. What did you think of Brisker's play on Saturday, and what do you think his outlook is moving forward as a pro?
I mean, I fell in love with Jaquan Brisker week 1 of last season, college football season. If you remember that game against Wisconsin, it was on the road. Wisconsin had a chance to score the winning touchdown there on the final drive, if I'm not mistaken. And Jake Ferguson, the tight end for Washington, had a really good game. He was obviously the target that the quarterback kept coming back to over and over and over again. They get down inside the 10. I think they've got third or fourth down, and they're trying to score. And Brisker knows it. Brisker's on the back end, and I don't know if it was just robber or some kind of coverage where they allowed Brisker to kind of free roam and do what he wanted. But if you watch that play from the moment that ball is snapped, he knows the quarterback has to have a touchdown here. He's going to go to the guy he wants, and it's Ferguson. So you watch him. He takes kind of a step back, and then he drifts down into the box and is just waiting for that ball to come over the middle and go to Jake Ferguson. And he bails on whoever was coming anywhere near him, and he jumps right in front of that ball. He picks it off, and Penn State wins that game. That right there, that moment, I was like, that's the guy. That's the guy you want on the back end. That Tyrann Mathieu type of just let me move around and make plays and do what I want because I'm smarter than everybody else out here. I have the confidence, and I'm going to go make plays. Just let me go make plays. So I loved him as a prospect. I'll throw Kyler Gordon in there as well because obviously much is going to be made about the fact that they didn't take a wide receiver, especially with the way George Pickens is playing. We're all going to say, oh, my gosh, they could have had him, blah, blah, blah. If you remove that, though, and you look at the fact that this secondary absolutely needed playmaker at the corner to go with Jalen Johnson. They needed a playmaker at safety because Eddie Jackson's been kind of inconsistent, right? So what they got in those two guys, I had Brisker at 30 overall. I had Gordon at 34. So if I'm not mistaken, you got those guys at what, 36 and 48 or something like that?
39 and 48. Gordon was 39 and Brisker was 48.
So I had them flipped in terms of who was better on my overall board. But when you're talking about them as prospects, you're talking about complete guys that if you watch them play, there's not really a flaw. And we saw that particularly with Brisker on Saturday night. He was flying around in the backfield making plays. He's dropping back in coverage. He's comfortable in space. He's making plays in every type of way. And Gordon, I think, was the same type of player at Washington. We're used to DBs coming out of Washington ready to play in the NFL, right? They know how to develop guys in terms of their technique, in terms of their intelligence, their instincts, and what they're seeing. Obviously, they're great at film study because you see that played out on Saturdays. So you've got two great athletes, two guys with great instincts, great intelligence that obviously watch a lot of film and know what they're looking at and can translate it to the field on game day. You got one guy at corner who can do it. You got one guy at safety who can do it. And when you have that, I mean, that you can shore up an entire unit like that. It means so much for your defense and so much for that side of the ball. So while, yeah, you know, it would have stolen more headlines if they had gotten George Pickens and he'd be making these plays for Justin Fields. I get that. And I'd like to get to polls and free agency in a minute, but the top of that draft class, they got two guys, in my opinion, who if they would have gone in the first round, I don't think anybody would have batted an eye, right? Those two guys were talked about mid to late first round for most of the process, and a lot of different spots they could have gone there on the back half of the first round, and nobody would have been surprised. So to get them, you know, top 10, top 15, middle of the second round, again, I think could really transform that entire secondary because they're both playmakers.
And we saw it on Saturday against the Chiefs. I mean, Brisker brought a different just vibe to the field. And there is so much intangible value. You can't measure it on Pro Football Focus's analytics. The guys who like to throw stats out there on Twitter who talk about whatever DVOA numbers you want to throw out there. I get it. And I understand the place in football analysis when it comes to analytics and numbers and stats and percentages and all these other things that it almost seems like you need an advanced degree these days to understand. But there's also just something about, like Matty Eberflus, the Bears coach, says, it's like what happens on the grass. That matters. And when Jaquan Brisker is bringing this element of toughness and physicality and just his teammates around him, you know, elevate their play when they see a guy who's as young as he is, he just being in the right place at the right time and making that big hit that's going to bring the crowd to their feet. That matters. You know, momentum and intensity and energy. You know, players feed off of that. And I felt like when I was watching the game Saturday night and seeing how Brisker was bringing that old school feel back to the Bears defense, that's going to go a long way in making him the right pick, right? Yeah, George Pickens, he was a guy that I was banging the table for leading into the draft because I thought if he wasn't coming off a bad knee injury, he might have been the first receiver taken. And getting a player with that talent level in the second round for a team that is trying to do whatever it can to ensure that the franchise quarterback has a path to success, that would have seemed like a really, really good value and need selection. But when you take a step back and look at the bigger picture and the concept of building a football team from the ground up, Sometimes the wide receiver is kind of like the cherry on top. It's like you've built a strong defense, you've built a strong offensive line. Now go get the race car, right? Now go get the sports car that you could take out on a beautiful Sunday afternoon and just, pedal to the metal. And the Bears aren't really there yet. And maybe a George Pickens, by the time George Pickens, or by the time the Bears were ready to compete with a George Pickens type player on the roster, we might have been sitting here with a DK Metcalf, Deebo Samuel, third-year player demanding a monster contract by the time the Bears are actually ready to compete with him. And who knows what that would have done to the whole team structure around him. Sometimes, though, Luke, we find studs and gems that aren't draft picks, right? And I think the best draft classes often are the ones where you can hang your hat on one or two undrafted free agents who end up making the roster. And the star of Saturday night in the Bears' first preseason game was linebacker Jack Sanborn from Wisconsin. The dude was all over the place. 7 total tackles, 5 on defense, 2 on special teams, interception, forced a fumble, recovered a fumble. He filled up the stat sheet. He stuffed the box score the way undrafted rookies need to do to make a roster. And look, with the Roquan Smith situation and the linebacker depth on the Bears, questionable at best. Tell us a little bit about Jack Sanborn. And does he really have a chance not only to make the team, but to become an impact defender in Chicago down the road?
Yeah, Sanborn's one of those guys that you look at and you wonder what's wrong with him. Like why? I mean, I think he's been banged up a little bit, had some injury issues that I think forced him to come back for that final year at Wisconsin. But I mean, he came back and played really well for the Badgers last year. And we're again, another program where we're used to seeing guys come out of that program, especially at that position, and play really well at the next level. But I mean, he had 13, 14 tackles for loss last year. He was an all Big Ten linebacker last year. So it's not like he came out of nowhere in terms of his draft stock. I think he's a victim of how long that draft process is, right? And how much weight is put into size, speed, and athleticism. And if you don't hit certain landmarks, you don't hit certain 40-yard dash times or what have you, your 3-cone drill or whatever. And not, again, kind of like the Pro Football Focus stuff. There's value to those numbers, and I understand that. But again, sometimes it's just about what happens on the grass, man. It's just about can you go out and can you ball? And when Jack Sanborn's on the field, he balls out, he makes plays, and that's what he did Saturday. I don't think anybody could go back and look at the way he played at Wisconsin and be like, wow, that's a surprise that he played that way. That he was that player for a Power 5 program and a really successful one at that. So again, not surprising to me, and one of those guys that really should have found a spot in those 7 rounds in the NFL draft. But like you said, with the situation the Bears find themselves in now, who knows what's going to happen with Roquan Smith? They may end up needing Jack Sanborn more than they thought. And if what they saw Saturday night is any indication, they obviously have a steal there.
And it's something to be said for guys that enter the league with a chip on their shoulder. A guy like Sanborn was a decorated player in college. He was as consistent as the day is long at his position. And you'd like to think NFL teams value consistent production from guys who will end up playing a position that requires consistency in the NFL, being in like we were talking about with Brisker, being in the right place at the right time, being able to read offensive scheme, offensive lineman, being able to be a captain of the defense, essentially requires at the most fundamental level, a consistent level of play. And Sanborn was that. Whether or not the NFL game is going to be too fast for him or something that just, his head's spinning, because sometimes, look, a really good college player can max out as a really good college player. Then they get to the league. And yes, there is something about, NFL is a fast man's game. And if you are just below that threshold, it's tough to hang around for a while. But Sanborn proved, at least in one small sample size, that he can hang around. And I don't think guys rack up 7 tackles, get an interception, force and recover fumbles by accident. Those are guys that are playing the game the right way, doing the right thing. And for a coach like Matt Eberflus, who preaches about intensity and hustle and smart football, Jack Sanborn seems to kind of encapsulate all of that right now. And when you think about this tug of war the Bears are in with Roquan Smith, even though Roquan Smith is going to play weak side linebacker,
right?
You got to think a guy like Sanborn, he's got a chance to hang around for a while. The Bears can't afford to get rid of any linebackers right now. And I think Sanborn's first impression that he made Saturday against the Chiefs is going to be something that's going to push him through the final roster, to be honest with you. Speaking of the final roster, one guy that we know is going to be around is Justin Fields. Justin Fields is going to be around hopefully for a very long time in Chicago. Bears fans have been praying for a player like this for essentially my entire life. And if there's Bears fans who are older than me listening to this, which probably isn't the case based on the gray hairs that you can see on my head, it's been a while. So getting to see him play for the first time under a competent coaching staff was refreshing on Saturday. It's not like he lit up the stat sheet, 4-7 for 48 yards. He did run for 10 yards. He didn't score, lead the Bears on any touchdown passes. He didn't run for any touchdowns. So there was no Sports Center moment for Justin Fields on Saturday. But Bears fans, I'm sure, agree with me when I say there was something different about Justin Fields against the Chiefs. He looked, like I said in the open, he looked calm. He looked composed. Even his incompletions looked harmless. He was under pressure. That was a little disturbing. The offensive line definitely didn't hold up as well as a Bears fan would probably like. But even the way he handled that pressure, finding his outlets, dumping passes off to Khalil Herbert, even if they weren't receptions, making the right decisions. It seems pretty apparent to me that there's going to be an uptick in Justin Fields' level of play. But before we kind of talk about what could be ahead in 2022 and maybe some of the things you saw that you were encouraged or discouraged by with Fields on Saturday, just take me through that 2021 draft and where you had Justin Fields compared to, and that was supposed to be a historic quarterback class with Trevor Lawrence and Zach Wilson and Trey Lance and Mac Jones and obviously Justin Fields. Where did you have him in that pecking order, and what have you seen from him to date before we get into 2022 that kind of shapes your opinion moving forward?
Well, I challenge you to find anybody who was higher on Justin Fields than I was going into that draft. I had Trevor Lawrence number 1 overall. I had Kyle Pitts number 2 overall, and I had Justin Fields at number 3. So not just in terms of his quarterback, the way he ranked in that quarterback class with those 5 guys that went in the top 15. But he was a guy that I think in any other draft that didn't have a guy like Trevor Lawrence, right, where we, from the moment he went to Clemson was like, it's just a countdown to when he's the number 1 pick with the way he played against Alabama as a freshman. We're thinking he's going to be the pick. If it's any other class and that type of guy's not in it, I thought Justin Fields, what else does a guy have to do and have to possess in terms of his skill set to not be that number 1 pick type of quarterback? He's big. He's not just tall. He's athletic. He's got the arm. He's got the athleticism. He had everything you wanted. Played at a huge program, played in playoff games, played in big games, and came up big in those games. I mean, he had everything, right? And I mean, the toughness, the way he played through the injury and against Clemson and just lit up that defense. So much on that resume that I just did not understand. A lot of the criticisms going into that draft, didn't understand the fact that he did not go in the top 10. Teams like Carolina, teams like Denver, obviously now it's different for Denver with Russell Wilson, but tell me Carolina wouldn't rather have Justin Fields right now instead of choosing between Baker Mayfield and Sam Darnold. So in terms of a prospect, that just kind of tells you how highly I thought of Justin Fields and what he brought to the table. Thought he had great leadership ability, and just I couldn't find a flaw. And again, this is a draft that had, Penei Sewell and Jamar Chase and so many other top prospects at other positions that I could have easily put in that number 3 spot. And I was just so impressed with what Justin Fields brought to the table. And if it wasn't a class where Trevor Lawrence was in it, if I were the Jaguars, I would have taken him number 1.
Yeah, and I think you look back at how the draft process tends to unfold, and there is this paralysis by over-analysis that happens, right? Like Justin Fields, almost maybe not to the
he was
depths
too good
of
for
Trevor
too
Lawrence.
long. People get bored.
He was, right? I mean, you remember that he was on that QB1 documentary, that Netflix series from years ago when he was in high school.
Right.
He was the guy who, I believe, he broke Deshaun Watson's Georgia records in high school. Somebody has to back check me on that one. But I mean, this guy has been pegged as a franchise quarterback from the youngest level of football, and he's delivered everywhere he's gone. I mean, he's delivered. And it might take a little longer for him. I think we have seen in his career arc, even dating all the way back to high school, that sophomore year on, that second, third year on, is when he really breaks out. One of the things that impresses me most about Justin is he's such a smart guy. When I watch his press conferences compared to Mitch Trubisky before him, and Mitch Trubisky would give such, football cliche answers and would just seem like he just didn't have enough going on between the ears to really make it in the league. Justin Fields is a different dude. Like, he can repeat verbatim almost what reporters ask him, even if it's a long-winded question. And the thought and depth that he puts into answers, even if they're quick, few word sentence answers, it's just so to the point, and he delivers it so well with such confidence. That matters, right? A lot of successful quarterbacking in the league, the difference between a jag, just a guy, and a quarterback who makes it as a franchise player is more than just talent in the arm and talent in the legs and good mechanics. It's a lot about what goes on upstairs above the shoulders. And Justin Fields has that. And I think what we're seeing now is a product of that, a byproduct of that. A guy who is smart, is going to use an offseason to learn from year one mistakes, or not even mistakes, just year one experiences. The NFL is new for every rookie. And for quarterbacks, it's like, flying a jet with no training, right?
10 times
so
worse. Yeah.
You're right. So now he's coming into year two he knows what's going on in the curtain. And he has an offensive coordinator who's tailoring an offense to his skill set. Who's going to make
that?
I mean, think about how easy football can be, Luke, right? How easy it can be if you take ego and personality out of the process. Matt Nagy's ego stopped him from being a coach of the Chicago Bears for a decade. Matt Nagy probably would still be here right now if he put his playbook aside, put his ego aside, put the smartest man in the room mentality aside, and realized I have to tailor my offense and the Chicago Bears offense to what this guy, Justin Fields, does well, because I'm going to ride the Fields train. I'm going to be in this town as long as he's successful. And he did the opposite. He didn't even.
It's not.
Luke, think about this.
Plenty of time to do it.
and think about this. He didn't even give Justin Fields an opportunity to be a starter over Andy Dalton in his first training camp. If that didn't go to tell you,
we knew right then, Brian.
It's over. It's over. It is over. There's no turning. There's no going back from that. So the difference now is, at least what I saw on Saturday with Justin, is comfort. And comfort comes in from different sources. It's comfort in knowing what an NFL defense looks like, knowing what NFL speed feels like, and understanding what's expected of you from a certain play call, understanding what your reads are in that play, because maybe it's been simplified by an offensive coordinator who's just putting a playbook together that is tailored for you. What do you think is if you had a chance to watch him on Saturday night, what are your first impressions from Justin's game, and what is your outlook for him in 2022? Like, when you're a draft analyst like you are, and like I've done, you don't evaluate your scouting report for 3 years. General rule is you wait 3 years. If you were right, if you were wrong, it takes a guy a couple years to know that. So Justin's in year two. You said he was the number 3 player on your board. Now, to justify that ranking, he's got to be a game changer, right? But it doesn't mean he has to be a game changer in year two. So what are you expecting from him this year to kind of stay on that track to validating your scouting report?
Well, I mean, you talked about it in terms of the confidence and the comfort level in those changes and the things that are different, both in terms of his experience now after having that season. And you could even argue that there will be some benefits to the fact that he had to go through so much garbage last year, right? With the coaching and the play calling and the offensive line and all that, the lack of weapons, so much structurally and organizationally around him was so bad that there's some good that's going to come out of that adversity, right? Learning to go through that as a quarterback and as a leader, it's going to make him a better leader. I think guys are going to follow him maybe even more so than they would have if he hadn't had those challenges to overcome. So there's some silver linings to that. I played quarterback. I didn't break any of Deshaun Watson's records in high school. I didn't play at Ohio State or anything like that. But I do remember the difference between my sophomore year of high school, when the tiny school that I was playing for, they were like, you're going to start at quarterback this year. And I was so afraid that, like, I didn't even understand how scared I was. I had to have a teammate come up to me and be like, dude, are you okay? And I'm like, what do you mean? He's like, you look like literally like a deer in the headlights. You look terrified. And I didn't understand. I was like, what do you mean? But that evidently was written all over my face that I had no clue what I was doing. And I compare that to when I had transferred schools. I didn't play quarterback my junior year, and I became the starter again at another school as a senior. And walking up to the line of scrimmage as a senior, after having some adversity, after having a year of experience as a starter where I had no clue what I was doing, I mean, at that point, I was walking up the line of scrimmage, like winking at linebackers and getting them all angry. And like, you talk about the confidence and the comfort level, like it was just night and day for two reasons. One, I knew what to expect. I had gone through that period of growth and understanding of what's happening in front of me, and the game is slowing down. And also that second part that you talked about, I had a coaching staff that was confident in what I was doing. I played at a school that ran the wing tee for like 35 years. Until I became the quarterback, and they were like, we might have to throw the ball a little bit more because we don't have the offensive line we used to have, and we actually have a quarterback who we think can sling the ball around a little bit. And so that's what they did. When I walked up the line of scrimmage, I knew I had a coaching staff finally that was like, hey, this kid can play, and it made me believe that I could do it too. And I had a really good senior year. I really enjoyed that season, and I bring it back to Justin Fields because I see that. I saw it obviously a little bit in limited work on Saturday. But you're going to see it so much more in the regular season. You're going to see a guy who has the confidence of his coaching staff. They believe in him. I don't think Matt Nagy believed in him at all. I think he was trying as much as he could to avoid getting him on the field. Once Andy Dalton got injured and he was kind of forced into it, he still didn't lean into it. He still didn't mold the offensive play calling and the game plan around what Justin Fields did well. He wanted to continue to put a square peg in a round hole. And obviously that did not work well for everybody involved. But now you're going to see Justin Fields walk up to the line of scrimmage with just a completely different confidence about it, not just because of his own ability. I think he was always confident in that. But when your surroundings, when your offensive line is a little bit better, when your pass catchers are a little bit better, and when your coaching staff and the organization has invested in you to the point that they actually have this year, even just philosophically in terms of, you're our guy and we're going to build around you. It's just night and day. And again, that's good for any player, but when you have a franchise quarterback, it's absolutely invaluable.
I completely agree. And I think we're going to see, like you said, as the season goes on, just a slow and steady improvement every week. And even as a game goes on, Justin, you could tell, I feel like he probably wanted to get another series in the game against the Chiefs. He's a competitor. And as the season marches on and the regular season unfolds and maybe the Bears are in a competitive game, you're just going to see that it factor that separated him a lot in college football come out in the league finally. Let's kind of tie up this conversation about the Bears with Ryan Poles. I almost said Ryan Pace. With Ryan Poles, the first-time general manager, who we got the first look of at what his rebuilt. I don't want to say rebuilt. It's kind of more like the torn down and phase one of this rebuild.
Right.
The roster that he's been putting together in action on Saturday night. And even though it might not be a full 4 quarters of evaluation, we did get to see some of the guys that he brought in. Tajay Sharp made a couple nice plays. Equanimus St. Brown, he looked all right on end around. Some of the offensive linemen that he signed, maybe not all of them looked elite, but the Bears offensive line is going to be better than it was last year. Now, one of the things that Poles took criticism for is kind of what you had mentioned. Did he do enough to invest in Justin Fields to show that he believes in him? And the headlines suggest no, because there's no headline grabbing transaction. There is no George Pickens draft pick. There was no high priced free agent offensive lineman signed, but kind of do a deeper dive here. He drafted 4 offensive linemen, signed 2 veteran starters on the eve of training camp. He drafted a wide receiver in the 3rd round and signed a collection of talented, athletic, well-built veteran receivers to compete for targets. These guys are decent football players, Luke. I mean, these guys are players who are at that point in their career. Equanimus St. Brown, if he can't prove it in Chicago, he's not going to get another opportunity to be starting wide receiver. Byron Pringle, if he doesn't prove that once he's outside of Tyreek Hill's shadow, that he's an actual NFL starter, he's not going to get that opportunity outside of Chicago. Velus Jones is coming into the league with a chip on his shoulder because everybody made fun of the fact that he's 25 years old. All of these guys have something to prove. And I think if you look at a common theme in the moves that Ryan Poles made in his first year, is he's signed a lot of these hunger guys that are coming in. We want to become a foundational player, not necessarily a game changer, but a foundational player from a culture standpoint with the Bears. What do you think? Forget about the game on Saturday, because it's not fair to assess a roster build based on a couple of snaps in a preseason. But what do you think? First, look at what Ryan Poles has done with this Bears team. Do you think the criticism has been justifiable, or do you think it's a little bit overblown because we're a Twitter generation? You want headlines, you want quick, instant gratification. Where do you kind of fall on the Ryan Poles spectrum right now?
Well, and honestly, this kind of ties into what the expectations should be for Justin Fields this year. And I think one of the things that will help maybe his development and help alleviate some of the pressure that normally a top 15 quarterback would have in his second year is the fact that because you have that coaching change and you have that regime change, and everybody kind of acknowledges like the Bears are still really rebuilding, and this is kind of rebuild year one because we can't really count last year because everybody was all over the place. That year is kind of forgiven in terms of Fields' development, in terms of like nobody's expecting them to make the playoffs this year, right? Nobody's expecting Justin Fields to go out and be a Pro Bowler. So he's got a little bit of that weight off of his shoulders in terms of like, listen, I don't have to save the world this year. I can go out there, I can take the check downs, take the easy plays, take the simple things and take what's there and slowly build this team. And that's what I think the philosophy was for Poles this offseason, right? And we can complain all day long, like you said, about the fact they didn't go out and steal the headlines with some of the guys they went out and get, and they didn't do what the Jaguars did and throw a bunch of money everywhere, which they had some money to work with. But it honestly reminds me of what happened here. It's kind of the opposite of what happened in Tampa Bay. When Jason Light came to Tampa Bay, where I'm at, in 2014, Lovie Smith had just been hired as the head coach of the Bucs, right? A guy you guys are obviously familiar with. And Lovie Smith was hired first. So Lovie Smith goes out and he gets to be part of who picks the GM, and Jason Light ends up being his pick, right? Well, Jason Light, first GM job, what does he do? He gets together with his head coach and he's like, hey, you've got experience here. Who do you want in free agency? Lovie Smith had taken a year off of coaching. He said he watched all this film. Get me these guys. And Jason Light went out and spent money on all of those guys that Lovie Smith wanted. And who were they? They were Michael Johnson, Anthony Collins. There were like 3 or 4 other guys, big money guys that they went out and just threw money at. And almost all of them busted really, really bad and were gone within a year or two. And, I've spoken to Jason Light one-on-one about that process. And he's told me just how much he learned about team development, what to do and what not to do based on that first experience and kind of, crashing and burning in his first offseason as a general manager. And how did he do it? He did it by just you had money to spend, you had needs, so you just went and spent it on the best possible veterans that were available, whether or not they were worth it or worthy of it or not. And most of them ended up not being that way. So I tell that as kind of a cautionary tale to anybody who wanted Ryan Poles to do the opposite of what he did this offseason. What he did was say, listen, we don't have to go out there and beat the world this year. So we don't want to go out there and waste all this money on guys that might not end up playing as well as the guys we did sign for half as much. So if you think about expectations, if you get the same amount of level of play, I know that there's a lot of variables there because all the different positions and stuff, but if you go out and sign a bunch of economical guys, and these aren't old veteran guys that he signed a lot of really young, like you said, hungry guys that are hitting that second contract, and maybe they didn't get as much money on the open market as they thought they would. Maybe they're coming from a team, like you said, Byron Pringle, who I'm a big fan of. He's from Robinson High School here in Tampa. A guy that was under somebody's shadow and wants to be a full-time starter. These guys that have been special teamers and spot starters, and now they're going to get a chance to compete for a starting job. You went out there and got them for not a whole lot of money. There's not a lot of contracts that are going to set this team back if they don't work out, right? The expectations are manageable. And if you get a certain level of play from those guys, the level of play you're going to have to get from those guys for it to be considered a win is not super high, right? Because you didn't invest a whole lot. You're hoping that they reach a certain level, but compare that to what happens if Jacksonville doesn't get anything out of Christian Kirk after giving him the contract they did? Now you're set back a ton of money, and you could get, again, the same level of play for Christian Kirk will be a disappointment, as opposed to if you get those same numbers from Byron Pringle, that's a huge win, right? So again, I think Poles had a very measured approach to this offseason. And I think even if it doesn't, quote unquote, work out, the resources that they've invested in it aren't going to make or break the rest of the regime. It's not going to set this team back so badly that you're not going to be able to recover from it in 2 or 3 years because of all the dead cap money you have and because you're still looking for that guy because he didn't work out. If any of these guys don't work out, it's not the end of the world. And if they do, it's a huge win and some economical ones that are going to give them space to give a big contract to a wide receiver if they want one, give a big extension to Justin Fields once he earns that over the next couple of years. I think to take this patient and slow and steady approach in his first offseason showed great patience and great restraint that, again, we don't really see in today's NFL because it is very instant gratification. Guys want to, if you have cap space and there's free agents out there that can help you, you want to throw money at those guys because to a certain extent, you have to win right away, right, in order to stick around. But I hope that Poles' approach pays off because I want NFL franchises to be taught that patience can be rewarded in this business. It doesn't happen very often, but I think it's going to be really easy for these guys to exceed expectations based on how much money they got. And I think it was a really smart way to play the offseason.
And like you said, I mean, even if you spin it back to the draft, all he needs is one of these guys on day 3 to hit. All he needs is Velus Jones to be a legitimate slot receiver who goes for 800 yards as a rookie and maybe returns a couple punts for touchdowns and looks like one of the more productive rookie receivers. And Poles was, air quotes, right with that decision. And then you have Jaquan Brisker turning into maybe one of the best defensive rookies in the league. Now you stack Brisker and Velus Jones. You know, maybe George Pickens has 1,090 yards and 8 touchdowns. But if Velus Jones ends up with 875 and 6, and you got Brisker too, right. Now you're saying, well, you know what? That was, Poles was playing chess while everybody else is thinking he was playing checkers, right? And if Braxton Jones hits in the 5th round, well, I mean, come on, a left tackle in the 5th round is a game-changing hit in the draft when it comes to building a team in the future. And there's no more franchise player out there than you, Luke. You are the man, the myth, the legend of the NFL draft community. Tell everybody where they can find you on social media, where they can find all your work online. Let the good listeners of Bears Talk know how to find you.
I mean, I keep it pretty simple. I'm at Luke Easterling on Twitter and at the Draft Wire. If you want to come look at the Draft Wire stuff, it's at draftwire.usatoday.com. And again, I told you this off air. I want to point out, I don't care about the Bears. I don't care if they suck or not. I actually grew up in Tampa watching this guy run all over, watching highlights of Walter Payton run all over the Creamsicle Bucks when I was a kid. So I don't even really like the Bears. I'm glad they're not in our division anymore. So, this is all just shooting straight from my experience evaluating players and evaluating the league and just kind of calling it how I see it, man. I think this team has a lot of promise. Again, the fact that the expectations aren't super high can be good for this team this year. But if Bears fans want to come and talk about it, come find me and let's chat.
Listen, A++ for the jersey choice. Sweetness will always have a place on this podcast. Luke, I can't wait to get you back during draft season, during the regular season, all throughout the college football season. The Bears are back in the first round in the 2023 draft, so the NFL draft will be a huge, huge part of the content here on the Bears Talk podcast and on bearstalk.com. So, Luke, really appreciate your time. We'll see you soon, my friend.
Hey, always a good time, Brian. Good stuff.
That was Luke Easterling, my guy. Follow him over on Twitter. Make sure you're following his work throughout the season. His NFL draft work, in my opinion, is second to none. Like I said, I've gotten to know Luke really well over the years, trips down to Mobile, Alabama with him, and just covering the draft from all angles. He is an A++ guy. So when he talks positively about some of these Bears picks, that's a good sign, Bears fans. That means that there's a good chance these guys are going to hit. We saw it on Saturday, right? Going to do a little quick recap here of that Chiefs game. I got to say, the win is nice, 19-14 victory over Kansas City to start the preseason 1-0. To me, though, the summer scrimmages, I don't really care about the wins and losses. I don't care about yards per carry or how many receptions or how many big plays a player makes in the game. For me, it's all about what does it look like on the grass? What does the coaching staff look like on the grass? What does the product look like on the field? And I think we're on to something here, Bears fans. I like the way Matt Eberflus and his coaching staff ran the sidelines. I like the way the offense was paced. I like the physicality that the defense played with, and even the offensive line after, yes, there was a couple of lapses here and there, but overall, I thought that the offensive line looked like it's got a chance to be much improved too. So the Bears are 1-0 this summer, and this is episode 1 of the Bears Talk podcast, and we're undefeated. go over to Apple Podcasts. Make sure you follow us. Go to our YouTube channel. Make sure you subscribe. Give us a 5-star rating on any of your podcast platforms. It helps spread the word for the show. We're going to be back later this week with a preview of the Bears' next preseason game, and we're going to talk about all the headlines. Maybe we'll have some Roquan Smith news. Obviously, something's going to bubble up over the next couple of days. Make sure you check out BearsTalk.com. Head over to Twitter. Follow me at Brian Perez NFL. Follow the Bears Talk account at the Bears Talk. And that's enough nonsense for now. Thank you for listening, and come back again real soon to the Bears Talk podcast.